Okay. So I have started recording now. Hello and welcome back. Ow! Ouch. I was putting on a sweater and the zipper got caught. Well, jacket. And the zipper got caught on my hair. Okay. So, here we are. Back again. So, last we left off at, still need to put tape on the seam of this book. We last left off with, Chiu-chan, or Sayuri, has now sold her virginity and is now a full-fledged geisha. And we continue on with her journey. So let me see how much I wanted to read. Alright, so here we are now, chapter 25. Let me see how much I want to read tonight. Sounds like a stretch, but you know what? I think I'll be willing. Alrighty, so we are now on to chapter 25. So chapter 25. Mama may have already won her bet with Mother, but she still had quite a stake in my future. So during the next few years, she worked to make my face familiar to all her best customers, and to the geisha and Gion as well. We were still emerging from the depression at the time. Formal banquets weren't as common as Mamaho would have liked, but she took me to plenty of informal gatherings. Not only parties in the tea houses, but swimming excursions, sightseeing tours, kabuki plays, and so on. During the heat of summer, when everyone felt most relaxed, these gatherings were often quite a lot of fun, even for those of us supposedly hard at work entertaining. For example, a group of men sometimes decided to go floating in a canal boat along the Kamo River to sip sake and dangle their feet in the water. I was too young to join in the carousing, but often ended up with the job of shaving ice to make snow cones. But it was a pleasant exchange. But it was a pleasant change nevertheless. Some nights, wealthy businessmen or aristocrats threw geisha parties for just for themselves. They spent the evening dancing and singing and drinking with the geisha, often until well after midnight. I remember on one of these occasions, The wife of our host stood at the door to hand out envelopes containing a generous tip as we left. She gave Mamaha two of them and asked her the favor of delivering the second to the geisha Tomizuru, who had gone home earlier with a headache, as she put it. But she knew as well as we did that Tomizuru was her husband's mistress and had gone with him to the other wing of the house to keep him company for the night. Many of the glamorous parties in Gion were attended by famous artists and writers and kabuki actors, and sometimes they were very exciting events. But I'm sorry to tell you that the average geisha party was something much more mundane. The host was likely to be the division head of a small company, and the guest of honor one of his suppliers, or perhaps one of his employees he just promoted, or something along those lines. Every so often, some well-meaning geisha admonished me that as an apprentice, my responsibility, besides trying to look pretty, was to sit quietly and listen to conversations in hopes of one day becoming a clever conversationalist myself. Well, most of the conversations I heard at these parties didn't strike me as very clever at all. A man might turn to the geisha beside him and say, "The weather certainly is unusually warm, don't you think?" And the geisha would reply with something like, "Oh yes, very warm." And then she'd begin playing a drinking game with him, or try to get all the men singing. And soon the man who'd spoken to her was too drunk to remember he wasn't having as good a time as he'd hoped. For my part, I always considered this a terrible waste. If a man has come to Gyeong just for the purpose of having a relaxing time and ends up involved in some childish game of paper, scissors, stone, well, in my view, he'd better well, in my view, he'd have been better off staying at home than playing with his own children or grandchildren, who, after all, are probably more clever than this poor dull geisha he was so unfortunate as to sit beside. Every so often, though, I was privileged to overhear a geisha who really was clever, and Mamaha was certainly one of these. I learned a great deal from her conversations. For example, if a man said to her, "Warm weather, don't you think?" she had a dozen replies ready. If he was old and lecherous, she might say to him, "Warm? Perhaps it's just the effect on you of being around so many lovely women." Or if he was an arrogant young businessman who didn't seem to know his place, she might take him off his guard by saying, "Here you are sitting with half a dozen at the base geisha in Gyeon, and all you can think to talk about is the weather." One time, when I happened to be watching her, Mama had knelt beside a very young man who couldn't have been more than 19 or 20. He probably wouldn't have been at a geisha party at all if his father hadn't been the host. Ah! Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. One time when I happened to be watching her, Mama had knelt beside a very young man who couldn't have been more than 19 or 20. He probably wouldn't have been at a geisha party at all if his father hadn't been the host. Of course, he didn't know what to say or how to behave around geisha, and I'm sure he felt nervous. But he turned to Mama very bravely and said to her, Warm, isn't it? She lowered her voice and answered him like this, and answered him like this. Why, you're certainly right about it. Yeah. Why, you're certainly right about it being warm. You should have seen me when I stepped out of the bath this morning. Usually, when I'm completely naked, I feel so cool and relaxed. But this morning, there were little beads of sweat covering my skin all the way up my body, along my thighs and on my stomach, and, well, other places too. When that poor boy set his sake cup down on the table, his fingers were trembling. I'm sure he never forgot that geisha party for the rest of his life. If you ask me why most of these parties were so dull, I think probably there were two reasons. First, just because a young girl has been sold by her family and raised from an early age to be a geisha doesn't mean she'll turn out to be clever or have anything interesting to say. And second, the same goes for the men. Just because a man has made enough money to come to Guillaume and waste it however he chooses doesn't mean he's fun to be around. In fact, many of the men are accustomed to being treated with a great deal of respect. Sitting back with their hands on their knees and big frowns on their faces is about as much work as they plan to do in the way of entertaining. One time, I listened to Mamaha spend an entire hour telling stories to a man who never even looked in her direction, but just watched the others in the room while she talked. Oddly enough, this was just what he wanted, and he always asked for Mamaha when he came to town. After 2 more years of parties and outings, while all the while continuing with my studies and participating in dance performances when I could, I made the shift from being an apprentice to being a geisha. This was in the summer of 1938, when I was 18 years old. We call this change turning the collar. Okay, so she wasn't officially a geisha, but she was like, she could attend more things than she could as an apprentice, I guess. That's how I see it. Yes. This was in the summer of 1938, when I was 18 years old. We call this change turning the collar, because an apprentice wears a red collar while a geisha wears a white one. Though, if you were to see an apprentice and a geisha side by side, their collars would be the last thing you'd notice. The apprentice, with her elaborate long-sleeved kimono and dangling obi, would probably make you think of a Japanese doll, whereas the geisha would look simpler, perhaps, but also more womanly. I think the Mizawage was like the turning point of like her not just being an apprentice anymore. That's how I see it. Yeah, apprentice plus. Yeah, the apprentice with her elaborate long sleeve kimono and dangling obi would probably make you think of a Japanese doll, whereas the geisha would look simpler, perhaps, but also more womanly. The day I turned my collar was one of the happiest days of Mother's life, or at least she acted more pleased than I'd ever seen her. I didn't understand it at the I didn't understand it at the time, but it's perfectly clear to me now what she was thinking. You see, a geisha, unlike an apprentice, is available to a man far for more than just pouring his tea, provided the terms are suitable. Just, yeah, because of my connection with Mamaha and my popularity in Guillaume, My standing was such that mother had plenty of cause for excitement. Excitement being, in mother's case, just another word for money. Ah, okay, that's what's separate. Okay. I kind of get it now. And I guess like she's still in like training still, so since moving to New York, I learned what the good since moving to New York, I've learned that the word geisha really mean what the word geisha really means to most Westerners. From time to time at elegant parties, I've been introduced to some young woman or other in a splendid dress and jewelry. When she learns I was a geisha, when she learns I was once a geisha in Kyoto, she forms her mouth into a sort of smile, although the quarters don't although the corners don't turn up quite as they should. She has no idea what to say, and then the burden of conversation falls to the man or woman who has introduced us, because I've never really learned much English, even after all these years. Of course, by this time, there's little point even in trying, because this woman is thinking, my goodness, I'm talking with a prostitute. A moment later, she's rescued by her escort, a wealthy man by a wealthy man a good 30 or 40 years older than she is. Well, I often find myself wondering why she can't sense how much we really have in common. She is a kept woman, you see. In my day, so was I. I'm sure there are a great many things I don't know about these young women and their splendid dresses, but I often have the feeling that without their wealthy husbands or boyfriends, many of them would be struggling to get by and might not have the same proud opinion of themselves. And of course, the same thing is true for the first class geisha. Yeah, and of course, the same thing is true for a first class geisha. It is all very well for a geisha to go from party to party and be popular with a great many men, but a geisha who wishes to become a star is completely dependent on having a danna. Even Mamaha, who became famous on her own because of an advertising campaign, would soon have lost her standing and been just another geisha if the Baron hadn't covered the expenses to advance her career. No more than 3 weeks after I turned my collar, Mother came to me one day while I was eating a quick lunch in the reception room and sat across the table along wall puffing on her pipe. I'd been reading a magazine, but I stopped out of politeness, even though Mother didn't seem at first to have much to say to me. After a time, she put her pipe down and said, "You shouldn't eat those yellow pickles. They'll rot your teeth. Look at what they did to mine." It had never occurred to me that Mother believed her stained teeth had anything to do with eating pickles. When she'd finished giving me a good view of her mouth, she picked up her pipe again and took a puff of smoke. "Auntie loves yellow pickles, ma'am," I said, "and her teeth are fine." "Who cares if Auntie's teeth are fine? She doesn't make money from having a pretty little mouth. Tell the cook not to give them to you. Anyway, I didn't come here to talk with you about pickles. I came to tell you that this time next month you'll have a danna." "A danna? But Mother, I'm only 18. Hatsumomo didn't have a danna until she was... Yeah, Hatsumomo didn't have a danna until she was 20. And of course, that didn't last. You ought to be very pleased." "Oh, I am very pleased. But won't it require a lot of my time to keep my danna happy?" Mamaha thinks I should establish my reputation first, just for a few years. Mamaha, what does she know about business? The next time I want to the next time I want to know when to giggle at a party, I'll go and ask her. Nowadays, young girls, even in Japan, are accustomed to jumping up from table and are accustomed to jumping up from the table and shouting at their mothers. But in my day, we bowed and said, "Yes, ma'am," and apologized for having been troublesome. And that's exactly how I responded. Leave the business to me. Leave the business decisions to me, Mother went on. Only a fool would pass something off for like the one Nobu Toshikazu was made. My heart nearly stopped when I heard this. I suppose it was obvious that Nobu would one day propose himself as my Danna. After all, he made an offer for my Mizuwage several years earlier, and since then has certainly asked for my company more frequently than any other man. I can't pretend I hadn't thought of this possibility, but that isn't to say I'd ever believed it was the course my life would really take. On the first day I met Nobu at the sumo tournament, my almanac reading had been, "A balance of good and bad can open the door to destiny." Nearly every day since, I'd thought of it in one way or another. Good and bad. Well, it was Mamaha and Hatsumomo. It was my adoption by mother and the Mizuwake that had brought it about. And of course, it was the chairman and Nobu. I don't mean to suggest I disliked Nobu. Quite the opposite. But to become his mistress would have closed my life from the chairman forever. Mother must have noticed something of the shock I felt at hearing her words, or, in any case, she wasn't pleased at my reaction. But before she could respond, I heard a noise in the hallway outside, like someone suppressing a cough, and in a moment, Hatsumomo stepped in the open doorway. She was holding a bowl of rice, which was very rude of her. She would never have walked away from the table with it. When she swallowed, she let out a laugh. "Mother! Mother!" she said. "Are you trying to make me choke?" Apparently, she'd been listening to our conversation while she ate her lunch. "So the famous Sayuri is going to have Nobu Toshikazu as for her Danna," she went on. "Isn't that sweet? If you've come here to say something useful, then say it," Mother told her. "Yes, I have," Hatsumomo said gravely, and she came and knelt at the table. "Sayuri-san, you may not realize it, but one of the things that goes on between a geisha and her Danna can cause the geisha to become pregnant. Do you understand? And a man will become very upset if his mistress gives birth to another man's child. In your case, you must be especially careful, because Nobu will know at once if the child happens to have 2 arms like the rest of us, that it can't possibly be his." Hatsumomo thought her little joke was very funny. "Perhaps you should cut off one of your arms, Hatsumomo," said Mother, "if it will make you as successful as Nobu Toshikazu has been. And probably it would help too, if my face looked like this," she said, smiling, and picked up her rice bowl so we could see what was in it. She was eating rice mixed with red adzuki beans, and in a sickening way, it did look like blistered skin. As the afternoon progressed, I began to feel dizzy, with a strange buzzing in my head, and soon made my way to Mamaha's apartment to talk with her. I sat at her table sipping at my chilled barley tea, for we were in the heat of summer, and trying not to let her see how I felt. Reaching the chairman was the one hope that had motivated me all through my training. If my life had no, if my life would be nothing more than Nobu and dance recitals and evening after evening Gion, then I couldn't think why I had struggled so. Already, Mamaha had waited a long time. Uh, already, Mamaha had waited a long while to hear why I'd come. But when I set my glass of tea down on the table, I was not. I was afraid my voice would crack if I tried to speak. I took a few more moments to compose myself, and then finally swallowed and managed to say, Mother tells me that within a month it's likely I'll have a danna. Yes, I know. And the danna will be Nobu Toshikazu. By this time, I was concentrating so hard on holding myself back from crying. I could no longer speak at all. Nobu-san is a good man, she said, and very fond of you. Yes, but Mamaha-san, I don't know how to say it. This was never what I imagined. What do you mean? Nobu-san has always treated you kindly. But Mamaha-san, I don't want kindness. Don't you? I thought we all wanted kindness. Perhaps what you mean is that you want something more than kindness. And that is something you're in no position to ask. Of course, Mamaha was quite right. When I heard these words, my tears simply broke through the fragile wall that held them, and with a terrible feeling of shame, I laid my head upon the table and let them drain out of me. Only when I had composed myself afterward did Mamaha speak. What did you expect, Sayuri? She asked. Something besides this. I understand you may find Nobu difficult to look at, perhaps, but Mamaha-san, it isn't that. Nobu-san is a good man, as you say. It's just that you want your destiny to be, and it's just that you want your destiny to be like Shizu is. Is that it? Shizue, though she wasn't an especially popular geisha, was considered by everyone in Gion to be the most fortunate of women. For 30 years, she'd been the mistress of a pharmacist. He wasn't a wealthy man, and she wasn't a beauty. But you could have looked all over Kyoto and not found two people who enjoyed each other's company as they did. As usual, Mamaha had come closer to the truth than I wanted to admit. You're 18 years old, Sayuri, she went on. Neither you nor I can know your destiny. You may never know it. Destiny isn't always like a party at the end of the evening. Sometimes it's nothing more than struggling through life from day to day. But Mamaha-san, how cruel! Yes, it is cruel, she said. But none of us can escape destiny. Please, it isn't a matter of escaping my destiny or anything of that sort. Nobu-san is a good man. Just as you say, I know I should feel nothing but gratitude for his interest, but there are so many things I've dreamed about. And you're afraid that once Nobu has touched you, after that, they can never be. Really, Sayuri, what did you think life as a geisha would be like? Tell her your crush. I forget if she tells her or not. Really, Sayuri, What did you think what did you think life as a geisha would be like? We don't become geisha so our lives will be satisfying. We become geisha because we have no other choice. Oh, Mama Hassan, please, have I really been so foolish to keep my hopes alive that perhaps one day young girls hope all sorts of foolish things, Sayuri? Hopes are like hair ornaments. Girls want to wear too many of them. When they become old women, they look silly wearing even one. I was determined not to lose control of my feelings again. I managed to hold in all my tears except the few that squeezed out of me like sap from a tree. Mama Hassan, I said, do you have strong feelings for the Baron? The Baron has been a good Danna to me. Yes, of course, that's true. But do you have feelings for him as a man? I mean, some geisha do have feelings for their Danna, don't they? The Baron's relationship with me is convenient for him and very beneficial to me. If our dealings were tinged with passion, well, passion can quickly slip over into jealousy or even hatred. I certainly cannot. I certainly can't afford to have a powerful man upset with me. I've struggled for years to carve out a place for myself in Gion, but if a powerful man makes up his mind to destroy me, well, he'll do it. If you want to be successful, Sayuri, you must be sure that men's feelings remain always under your control. The Baron may be hard to take at times, but he has plenty of money, and he's not afraid to spend it. If he doesn't want children, and he doesn't want children, thank heavens, Nobu will certainly be a challenge for you. He knows his own mind much too well. I won't be surprised if he expects more from you than the Baron has expected of me. But, Mama Hassan, what about your feelings? I mean, hasn't there ever been a man... I wanted to ask if there had ever been a man who brought out feelings of passion in her, but I could see that her irritation with me. Yeah, but I could see that her irritation with me, if it had only, if it had been only a bud until then, had burst into full bloom now. She drew herself up with her hands in her lap. I think she was on the point of rebuking me, but I apologized for my rudeness at once, and she settled back down. You and Nobu have an end, Sayuri, and you cannot escape it, she said. I knew even then that she was right. An end is a karmic bond lasting a lifetime. Nowadays, many people seem to believe their lives are entirely a matter of choice, but in my day, we viewed ourselves as pieces of clay that forever show the fingerprints of everyone who has touched them. Nobu's touch had made a deeper impression on me than most. No one could tell me whether he would be my ultimate destiny, but I had always sensed the end between us. Somewhere in the landscape of my life, Nobu would always be present. But could it really be that all of the lessons I'd learned, the hardest one lay just ahead of me? Would I really have to take each of my hopes and put them away where no one would ever see them again? Where not even I would ever see them. Go back to the Okiya, Sayuri, Mama had told me. Prepare for the evening ahead of you. There's nothing like work for getting over a disappointment. I looked up at her with the idea of making one last plea. When I saw the expression on her face, I thought better of it. I can't say what she was thinking, but she seemed to be peering into nothingness with her perfect oval face, creased in the corners of her eyes and from mouth from strain. Then she let out a heavy breath and gazed down into her teacup with with what I took as a look of bitterness. A woman living in a grand house may pride herself on all her lovely things, but the moment she hears the crackle of fire, she decides very quickly which are the few she values most. Hold on. Yeah. Uh, yeah. A woman living in a grand house may pride herself on all her lovely things, but the moment she hears the crackle of fire, she decides very quickly which are the few she values most. In the days after Mama and I had spoken, I certainly came to feel that my life was burning down around me, and yet when I struggled to find even a single thing that would matter to me after Nobu had become my Dana, I'm sorry to say that I failed. One evening, while I was kneeling at a table in the Ichiriki tea house, try, excuse me. Yeah. One evening, while I was kneeling at a table at the Ichiriki tea house, trying not to think too much about my feelings of misery, I had a sudden thought of a child lost in the snowy woods, and when I looked up at the white-haired man, I was entertaining. Yeah, and when I looked up at the white-haired men I was entertaining, they looked so much like snow-capped trees all around me that I felt for one horrifying moment that I might uh, that I felt for one horrifying moment I may be the sole living human in all the world. The only parties at which I managed to convince myself that my life might still have some purpose, however small, were the ones attended by military men. Already in 1938, we'd all grown accustomed to daily reports about the war in Manchuria, and we were reminded every day of our troops overseas, like thing by things like the so-called Rising Sun lunchbox, which was a pickled plum in the center of a right. Yeah, which was a pickled plum in the center of a rice box, looking like the Japanese flag. For several generations, Army and Navy officers had come to relax. Yeah, so for several generations, Army and Navy officers had come to Guion to relax, but now they began to tell us, with watery eyes after their seventh or eighth cup of sake, that nothing kept their spirits up so much as their visits in Guion. Probably this was the sort of thing military officers say to the women they talk with, but the idea that I, too, was nothing more than a young girl from the seashore might truly be contributing something important to the nation. I won't pretend these parties did anything to lessen my suffering, but they did help remind me just how selfish my suffering really was. A few weeks passed, and then one evening, yeah, a few weeks passed, and then one evening in the hallway at the Ichiriki, uh, Mamaha suggested the time had come to collect on her bet with Mother. I'm sure you'll recall that the two of them had wagered about whether my debts would be repaid before I was 20. As it turned out, of course, they'd been repaid already, though I was only 18. Now that you've turned your collar, Mama has said to me, I can't see any reason why. I can't see any reason to wait longer. This is what she said, but I think the truth was more complicated. Mama knew that Mother hated settling debts and would hate settling them still more when the stakes went higher. My earnings would go up considerably after I took a dun nut. Mother was certain to grow only more protective of the income. I'm sure Mama had thought it best to collect what she was owed as soon as possible and worry about future earnings in the future. Several days afterward, Good night! Ugh. Yeah, several days afterward, I was summoned downstairs to the reception room of our Okia to find Mama and Mother across the table from each other, chatting about the summer weather. Beside Mama was a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Okada, whom I had met a number of times. She was the mistress of Okia where Mama had once lived, and she still took care of Mama's accounting in exchange for a portion of the income. I'd never seen her look more serious, peering down at the table with no interest in the conversation at all. There you are, Mother said to me. Your older sister has kindly come to visit and has brought Mrs. Okada with her. You certainly owe them the courtesy of joining us. Mrs. Okada spoke up, with her eyes still on the tabletop. Mrs. Nita. Yeah, Mrs. Nita. As Mama may have mentioned on the telephone, this is more a business call than a social call. There's no need for Sayuri to join us. I'm sure she has other things to do. I won't have her showing disrespect to the two of you, Mother replied. She'll join us at the table for a few minutes you're here. Yeah, she'll join us at the table for the few minutes you're here. So I arranged myself beside Mother, and the maid came in to serve tea. Afterward, Mama said, You must be very proud, Mrs. Dita, of how well your daughter is doing. Her fortune has surpassed expectations. Wouldn't you agree? Well now, what do I know of your... Well now, what do I know about your expectations, Mama Hassan? Mother said. After this, she clenched her teeth and gave one of her peculiar laughs, looking from one of us to the other to be sure we appreciated her cleverness. No one laughed with her, and Mrs. Okada just adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. Finally, Mother added, As for my own expectations, I certainly wouldn't say Sayuri has surpassed them. When we first discussed her prospects a number of years ago, Mama said, I had the impression you didn't think much of her. You were reluctant even to have me take on her training. I'm sure it wasn't as wise to put Sayuri's future in the hands of someone outside the Okia, if you'll forgive me, said Mother. We do have our Hatsumomo, you know. Oh, come now, Mrs. Nita, Mama said with a laugh. Hatsumomo would have strangled the poor girl before she'd have trained her. I admit Hatsumomo can be difficult, but when you spot a girl like Sayuri with something a little different, You have to be sure to make the right decisions at the right times, such as such as the arrangement you and I made, Mama Hassan. I expect you've come here today to settle our account. Mrs. Okada has been kind enough to write up the figures, Mamaha replied. I'd be grateful if you would take a look at them. Mrs. Okada straightened her glasses and took an accounting book from the bag at her knee. Mamaha and I sat in silence while she opened it on the table and explained her columns and figures, to Mother. These figures for Sayuri's own. Yeah. These figures for Sayuri's earnings over the past year. Uh, these figures for Sayuri's earnings over the past year. Mother interrupted. My goodness, I only wish we'd been so fortunate as you seem to think. They're higher even than the total earnings for our Akia. Yeah, they're higher even than the total earnings for our Okia. Yes, the numbers are most impressive, Mrs. Okada said, but I do believe they are accurate. I've kept careful track through the records of the Gion Registry Office. Mother clenched her teeth and laughed at this. I suppose because she was embarrassed at having been caught in her lie. Perhaps I haven't watched the accounts as carefully as I should have, she said. After 10 or 15 minutes, the two women agreed on a figure representing how much I'd earned since my debut. Mrs. Okada took a small abacus from her bag and made a few calculations, writing down numbers on a blank page of the account book. At last, she wrote down the final figure and underscored it. Here, then, is the amount Mamaha is entitled to receive. Considering how helpful she has been to our Sayuri, Mother said, I'm sure Mamaha-san deserves even more. Unfortunately, according to our arrangements, Mamaha agreed to take half of what a geisha in her position might usually take, until after Sayuri has repaid her debts. Now that the debts are repaid, Mamaha is, of course, entitled to the other half, so that she will have earned the full amount. My understanding is that Mamaha did agree to take half wages, Mrs. Okada said, but was ultimately to be paid double. This is why she agreed to take a risk. If Sayuri had failed to repay her debts, Mamaha would have received nothing more than half wages. But Sayuri has succeeded, and Mamaha is entitled to double. Really, Mrs. Okada, can you imagine me agreeing to such terms? Mother said. Everyone in Gion knows how careful I am with money. It's certainly true that Mamaha has been helpful to our Sayuri. I can't possibly pay double, but I'd like to propose offering an additional 10%. If I may so, it seems generous, considering that our Okia is hardly in a position to throw money around carelessly. The word of a woman in Mother's position should have been assurance enough. And with any woman but Mother, it certainly would have been. But now she'd made up her mind to lie. Well, we all sat in silence a long moment. Finally, Mrs. Okada said, Mrs. Nita, I do find myself in a bit. I do find myself in a difficult position. I remember quite clearly what Mama had told me. Of course you do, Mother said. Mama has her memory of the conversation, and I have mine. What we need is a third party, and happily we have one here with us. Sayuri may have been Sayuri may only have been a girl at the time, but she has quite a head for numbers. I'm sure her memory is excellent, Mrs. Okada remarked. But no one could hardly say she has no personal interest. After all, she is the daughter of the Okia. Yes, she is, said Mamaha. Yes, she is, said Mamaha. And this was the first time she'd spoken up in quite a while. But she's also an honest girl. I'm prepared to accept her answer, provided that Mrs. Nika will accept it too. Of course I will, Mother said, and put down her pipe. Now then, Sayuri, which is it? If I'd been given a choice between sliding off the roof to break my arm again, just the way I did as a child, or sitting in that room until I came up with an answer to the question they were asking, I certainly would have marched right up the stairs and climbed the ladder onto the roof. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I forget what she does. Yeah, if I had been given a choice between sliding off the roof to break my arm again, just the way I did as a child, or sitting in that room until I came up with an answer to the question they were asking me, I certainly would have marched right up the stairs and climbed the ladder onto the roof. Of all the women in Gion, Mamaha and Mother were the two most influential in my life, and it was clear to me I was going to make one of them angry. I had no doubt in my mind of the truth, but on the other hand, I had to go on living in the Okia with Mother. Of course, Mamaha had done more for me than anyone in Gion. I could hardly take Mother's side against her. Well, Mother said to me, as I recall, Mamaha did accept half wages, but you agreed to pay her double earnings in the end, Mother. I'm sorry, but this is the way I remember it. There was a pause, and then Mother said, Well, I'm not as young as I used to be. It isn't the first time my memory has misled me. We all have these sorts of problems from time to time, Mrs. Okada replied. Now, Mrs. Nita, what was this about offering Mamaha an additional 10%? I assume you meant 10% over the double you originally agreed to pay her. If only I were in a position to do such a thing, Mother said. But you offered it only a moment ago. Surely you haven't changed your mind so quickly. Mrs. Okada wasn't gazing at the tabletop any longer, but was staring directly at Mother. After a long moment, she said, I suppose we'll let it be. In any case, we've done enough for one day. Why don't we meet another time to work out the final figure? Mother wore a stern, wore a stern expression on her face, but she gave a little bow of assent and thanked the two for coming. I'm sure you must be very pleased, Mrs. Okada said, while putting away her abacus and her accounting book. That Sayuri will soon be taking a danna, and at only 18 years of age. How young to take such a big step. Mamaha would have done well to take a danna at that age herself, Mother replied. 18 is a bit young for most girls, Mamaha said, but I'm certain Mrs. Nita has made the right decision in Sayuri's case. Mother puffed on her pipe a moment, peering at Mamaha across the table. My advice to you, Mamaha-san, she said, is that you stick to teaching Sayuri about that pretty way of rolling her eyes. When it comes to business decisions, you may leave them to me. I would never presume to discuss business with you, Miss Nita. I'm convinced your decision is for the best. But may I ask, is it true the most generous offer has come from Nobu Toshikazu? His has been the only offer. I suppose that makes it the most generous. The only offer. Yeah, the only offer. What a pity. The arrangements are so much more favorable when several men compete. Don't you find it so? As I say, Mama Hassan, you can leave the business decisions to me. I have in mind a very simple plan for arranging favorable terms with Nobu Toshikazu. If you don't mind, Mamaha said, I'd be very eager to hear it. Mother put her pipe down on the table. I thought she was going to reprimand Mamaha, but in fact, she said, Yes, I'd like to tell it to you, now that you mention it. You may be able to help me. I've been thinking that Nobu Toshikazu will be more generous if he finds out an Iramura electric heater killed our granny. Don't you think so? Oh, I know very little about business, Mrs. Nita. Perhaps you or Sayuri should let it slip in conversation the next time you see him. Let him know what a terrible blow it was. I think he'll want to make it up to us. Yes, I'm sure that's a good idea, Mamaha said. Still, it's disappointing. I had the impression another man had expressed interest in Sayuri. 100 yen is 100 yen, whether it comes from this man or that one. That would be true in most cases, Mamaha said. But the man I'm thinking of is General Totori Junosuke. At this point in the conversation, I'd lost track of what the two of them were saying, for I'd begun to realize that Mamaho was making an effort to rescue me from Nobu. I certainly hadn't expected such a thing. I had no idea whether she'd changed her mind about helping me, or whether she was thanking me for taking her side against Mother. Of course, it was possible she wasn't really trying to help me at all, but had some other purpose. My mind went on racing with these thoughts, until I felt my mind kept racing with these thoughts, until I felt Mother tapping my arm with the stem of her pipe. Well, yes, she said. Ma'am? I asked if you know the general. I've met him a few times, Mother, I said. He comes to Gion often. I don't know why I gave this response. The truth is, I'd met the general more than a few times. He came to parties in Gion every week, though always as the guest of someone else. He was a bit on the small side, shorter than I was, in fact, but he wasn't the sort of person you could overlook, any more than you could overlook a machine gun. He moved very briskly and was always puffing on a cigarette after another, so that wisps of smoke drifted into the air around him, like the clouds of a train. Yeah, he moved very briskly, and was always puffing on one cigarette after another, so that wisps of smoke drifted in the air around him, like the clouds around a train idling on the tracks. One evening, while slightly drunk, the general had talked to me for the longest time about all the various ranks in the army, and found it very funny that I kept mixing them up. General Totori's own rank was Shoujo, which meant little general. That is to say, the lowest of the generals. And the foolish girl that I was, I had the impression this wasn't very high. He may have played down the importance of his rank from modesty, but I didn't know any better than him to believe him. By now, Mamaha was telling Mother that the general had just taken a new position. He'd been in charge of something called military procurement. Though, as Mamaha went on to explain, the job the job sounded like nothing more than a housewife going to the market. If the army had a shortage of ink pads, for example, the general's job was to make sure it got the ink pads it needed, and at a very favorable price. With his new job, said Mamaha, the general is now in a position to take a mistress for the first time, and I'm quite sure he has expressed an interest in Sayuri. Why would it matter to me if he's expressed an interest in Sayuri? Mother said. These military men never take care of a geisha the way a businessman or an aristocrat does. That may be true, Mrs. Nita, but I think you'll find that General Totori's new position could be of great help to the Okia. Nonsense! I don't need help taking care of the Okia. All I need is steady, generous income, and that's the one thing a military man can't give me. Those of us in Gion have been fortunate so far, Mamaha said, but shortages will affect us if the war continues. I'm sure they would if the war continued, Mother said. This war will be over in 6 months. And this is like in 1938. No, the war is not going to end. Not yet. This war will be over in 6 months. And when it is, the military will be in a stronger position than ever before. Mrs. Nita, please don't forget that General Totori is a man who oversees all the resources of the military. No one... Yeah, oof. Big yikes. Knowing the future. Yep. Anywho. And when it is, the military will be a stronger position than ever before. Miss Nita, please don't forget that General Totori is the man who oversees all the resources of the military. No one in Japan is in a better position to provide you with everything you could ever want. Whether the war continues or not. He approves every item passing through all the ports of Japan. All the ports in Japan. As I later learned, what Mamaha had said about General Totori wasn't quite true. He was only in charge only one of 5 large distributive. He was in charge of only one of 5 large administrative areas, but he was a senior of the men who oversaw the other districts, so he may as well have been in charge. In any case, you should have seen how Mother behaved after Mama had said this. You could almost see her mind at work as she thought about having the help of a man in General Totori's position. She glanced. She glanced at the teapot, just, um, and I could just imagine her thinking, "Well, I haven't." And I could imagine her thinking, "Well, I haven't had any trouble getting tea, not yet, though the price has gone up." And then, probably without even realizing what she was doing, she put one hand inside her obi and squeezed her silk bag of tobacco as if to see how much remained. Oh, God. Mother spent the next week going around Guion and making one phone call after another to learn as much as she could about General Totori. She was so immersed in this task that sometimes when I spoke to her, she didn't seem to hear me. I think she was so busy with her thoughts, her mind was like a train pulling too many cars. During this period, I continued saying Nobu whenever he came to Guion, and did my best to act as though nothing had changed. Probably he'd expected I would be his mistress by the middle of July. Certainly, I had expected it. But even when the men, but even when the month came to a close, his negotiations seemed to have led nowhere. Several times during the following weeks, I noticed him looking at me with puzzlement, and then one night, he greeted the mistress of the Ichirikiti house in the curst in the curtest manner I had ever seen, by strolling past without so much as a nod. The mistress had always valued Nobu as a customer, and gave yeah the mistress had always no has all the mistress had always valued Nobu as a customer, and gave me a look that seemed surprised and worried all at once. When I joined the party Nobu was giving, I couldn't help noticing signs of anger, a rippling muscle in his jaw, and a certain briskness that which he tossed into and a certain briskness with which he tossed sake into his mouth. I can't say I blamed him for feeling as he did. I thought he must consider me heartless to have repaid his many kindnesses with neglect. I fell into a gloomy spell thinking his thoughts, until the sound of a sake cup set down with a tick started. I fell into a gloomy spell thinking these thoughts, until the sound of a sake cup set down with a tick startled me out of it. When I looked up, Nobu was watching me. Guests all around him were laughing and enjoying themselves, and there he sat with his eyes fixed on me, as lost in his thoughts as I had been in mine. We were like two wet spots in the midst of burning charcoal. And that is the end of that chapter. Alright, next chapter is going to be chapter 26. Alright, chapter 26. During September of that year, while I was still 18 years old, General Totori and I drank sake together in a ceremony at the Ichirikiti house. This was the same ceremony I had first performed with Mamaha when she became my older sister, and later with Dr. Crabbe just before my Mizuwage. And in the weeks afterward, everyone congratulated Mother for having made such a favorable alliance. On that very first night after the ceremony, I went on the general's instructions to a small inn in the northwest of Kyoto called Suriya, with only 3 rooms. I was so accustomed by this time to lavish surroundings that the shabbinesss of the Suriya surprised me. The room smelled of mildew, and the tatami were so bloated and sodden that they seemed to make a sighing noise when I stepped on them. Plaster had crumbled near the floor in one corner. I could hear an old man reading a magazine. I could hear an old man reading a magazine article aloud in an adjacent room. The longer I knelt there, the more out of sorts I felt, so that I was positively relieved when the general finally arrived, even though he did nothing more, after I had greeted him, then turn on the radio and sit drinking a beer. After a time, he went downstairs to take a bath. When he returned to the room, he took off his robe at once and walked around completely naked, toweling his hair, with his little round belly protruding below his chest, and a great patch of hair underneath it. I had never seen a man naked before, and I found the general's sagging bottom almost comical. But when he faced me, I must admit my eyes went straight to well, where his eel ought to have been. Something was flapping around there, but only when the general lay on his back and told me to take off my clothes did it begin to surface. He he was such a strange little nugget of a man, but completely unabashed about telling me what to do. I had been afraid I'd have to find some way of pleasing him, but as it turned out, all I had to do was follow orders. In the 3 years since my Mizuwage, I had forgotten the sheer terror I had felt when the doctor finally lowered himself onto me. I remembered it now, but the strange thing was I didn't feel terror so much as a kind of vague queasiness. The journal left the radio on and lights as well, as if he wanted to be sure I saw the drabness of the room clearly, right down to the water stain on the ceiling. As the months passed, this queasiness went away, and my encounters with the general became nothing more than an unpleasant, twice-weekly routine. Sometimes I wondered what it would be like with the chairman, and to tell the truth, I was a bit afraid it might be distasteful, just as with the doctor and the general. Then something happened to make me see things differently. Around this time, a man named Yasuda Akira, who had been in all the magazines because of the success of a new kind of bicycle like he designed, began coming to Gion regularly. He wasn't welcome at the Ichiriki yet, and probably couldn't have afforded it in any case, but he spent 3 or 4 evenings a week at a little tea house called Tatematsu. Yeah, Tatematsu in the Tominaga-cho section of Gion, not far from Okia. I first met him at a banquet one night during the spring of 1939, when I was 19 years old. He was so much younger than the men around him, probably no more than 30, that I noticed him the moment I came into the room. He had the same sort of dignity as the chairman. I found him very attractive sitting there with his shirt sleeves rolled up and his jacket. Excuse me, I had to burp. Yeah, for a moment, where was I? Oh, okay. I found him very attractive sitting there with his shirt sleeves rolled up and his jacket behind him on the mats. For a moment, I watched the old man nearby, who raised up his chopsticks with a little piece of braised tofu, and his mouth already as wide as it could go. This gave me the impression of a door. This gave me the impression of a door being slid open, so that a turtle could march slowly through. By contrast, it made me almost weak to see the way Yasuda, Yasuda-san, with his graceful, sculpted arm, took a bite of braised beef. Put a bite of braised beef into his mouth with his lips parted sensuously. I made my way around the circle of men, and when I came to him and introduced myself, uh, he said, "I hope you'll forgive me." "Forgive you? Why? What have you done?" I asked him. I've been very I've been very rude," he replied. "I haven't been able to take my eyes off you all evening." On impulse, I reached for my obi for the card holder I kept there, and discreetly removed one card, which I passed to him. Geisha always carry name cards with them, just as businessmen carry business cards. Mine was very small, half the size of an ordinary calling card, printed on heavy rice paper with only the words Guillaume and Sayuri written on it in calligraphy. It was spring, so I was carrying cards decorated with a colorful spray of plum blossoms in the background. Yasuda admired it for a moment before putting it into his shirt pocket. I had the feeling no words we spoke could be as eloquent as this simple interaction. So I bowed to him and went on to the next man. From that day, Yasuda began asking me to the Tatamatsu tea house every week to entertain him. I was never able to go as often as he wanted me, but about 3 months after we first met, he bought me a kimono one afternoon as a gift. I felt very flattered, even though in truth it wasn't a sophisticated robe, woven with a poor quality of silk in somewhat garish colors, and with a commonplace design of flowers and butterflies. He wanted me to wear it for him one evening soon, and I promised him I would. But when I returned to the Okia with it that night, Mother saw me carrying the package upstairs and took it away from me to have a look. She sneered when she saw the robe, and said she wouldn't have me seen in anything so unattractive. The very next day, she sold it. When I found out what she'd done, I said to her as boldly as I dared that the robe had been given to me as a gift, not to the Okia, and that it wasn't right for her to have sold it. "Certainly it was your robe," she said, "but you are the daughter of the Okia. What belongs to the Okia belongs to you, and the other way around as well." I was so angry at Mother after this that I couldn't bring myself to look at her. As for Yasuda-san, he would wanted to see the robe on me. I told him that because of its colors and its butterfly motif, I could only wear it very early in the spring, and since it was now already summer, nearly a year would have to pass before he could see me in it. He didn't seem too upset to hear this. "What is a year?" he said, looking at me with penetrating eyes. I'd wait a good deal longer, depending on what I was waiting for. We were alone in the room, and Yasuda-san put his beer glass down on the table in a way that made me blush. He reached out for my hand, and I gave it to him, expecting that he wanted to hold it a long moment in both of his before letting it go again. But to my surprise, he brought it quickly to his lips and began kissing the inside of my wrist, quite passionately, in a way I could feel as far down as my knees. I think of myself as an obedient woman. Up until this time, I had generally done the things told to me by my mother or Mamaha or even Hatsumomo when I had no other choice. But I felt such a combination of anger at Mother and longing for Yasuda that I made up my mind right then to do the very thing Mother had ordered me most explicitly not to do. I asked him to meet me in that very tea house at midnight, and I just and I left him there and I left him there alone. Just before midnight, I came back and spoke to the young maid. I promised her an indecent sum of money if she would see to it that no one disturbed Yesula and me in one of the upstairs rooms for half an hour. I was already there, waiting in the dark, when the maid slid open the door and Yesula stepped inside. He dropped his fedora onto the mats and pulled me to my feet. Even before the door was closed. To press my body against his felt so satisfying, like a meal after a long spell of hunger. No matter how hard he pressed himself against me, I pressed back harder. Somehow I wasn't shocked to see how expertly his hand slipped through the seams of my clothing to find my skin. I will pretend I experienced none of the clumsy moments I was accustomed to with the general, but I certainly didn't notice them in the same way. My encounters with the general reminded me of a time as a child when I'd struggled to climb a tree and pluck away a certain leaf at the top. It was all a matter of careful movements, bearing the discomfort until I finally reached my goal. But with Yesula-san, I felt like a child running freely down a hill. Sometime later, when we lay exhausted upon the mats together, I moved his shirt tail aside and put my hand on his stomach to feel his breathing. I had never in my life been so close to another human being before, though we hadn't spoken a word. It was only then that I understood. It was one thing to lie still on the futon for the doctor or the general. It would be something quite different with the chairman. Many a geisha's day-to-day life has changed dramatically after taking a denna, but in my case, I could hardly see any change at all. I still made the rounds in Gion at night, just as I had over the past few years. From time to time during the afternoons, I went on excursions, including some very peculiar ones, such as accompanying a man on a visit to his brother in the hospital. But as for the changes I'd expected, the prominence But as for the changes I'd expected, the prominent dance recitals paid for my danna, lavish gifts provided by him, even a day or two of paid leisure time. Well, none of these things happened. It was just as Mother had said. Military men didn't take care of a geisha the way a businessman or an aristocrat did. The general may have brought about very little change in my life, but it was certainly true that his alliance with the Okia was invaluable, at least from Mother's point of view. He'd covered many of my expenses as a denna usually does, including the costs of my lessons, my annual registration fee, my medical expenses, and I don't know what else. My socks, probably. But more important, his new position as director of military procurement was everything Mama had suggested, so that he was able to do things for us no other Danna could have done. For example, Auntie grew ill during March of 1939. We were terribly worried about her, and the doctors were of no help. But after a telephone call to the general, an important doctor from the military hospital in the Kamigyo ward called on us and provided Auntie with a packet of medicine that cured her. So although the general may not have sent me to Tokyo for dance recitals or presented me with precious gems No one could suggest Arakia didn't do well by him. He sent regular deliveries of tea and sugar, as well as chocolates, which were becoming scarce even in Guion. And of course, Mother had been quite wrong about the war ending within 6 months. We couldn't have believed it we couldn't have believed it at the time, but we'd scarcely seen the beginning of the dark years just yet. During the fall, when the general became yeah during that fall when the general became my danna, Nobu ceased inviting me to parties where I'd so often entertained him. Soon I realized he stopped coming to the Ichiriki altogether. I couldn't think of any reason he should do this, unless it was to avoid me. With a sigh, the mistress of the Ichiriki agreed that I was probably right. At the new year, I wrote Nobu a card, as I did with all my patrons, but he didn't respond. It's easier for me to look back now and tell you how many months passed, but at that time I lived in anguish. I felt I had wronged a man who'd treated me kindly, a man who'd come to think of, a man I'd come to think of as a friend. What was more, without Nobu's patronage, I was no longer invited to Iwamura Electric's parties, which meant I hardly stood any chance at all of seeing the chairman. Of course, the chairman still came regularly to the Ichiriki, even though Nobu didn't. I saw him quietly upbraiding a junior associate in the hallway one evening, gesturing with a fountain pen for emphasis, and I didn't dare disturb him to say hello. Another night, a worried-looking young apprentice named Naotsu, with a terrible underbite, was walking him to the toilet when he caught sight of me. He left Naotsu standing there to come and speak with me. We exchanged the usual pleasantries. I thought I saw in his faint smile, the kind of subdued pride men often seem to feel when gazing on their own children. Before he continued on his way, I said to him, "Chairman, if there's ever an evening when the presence of another geisha or two might be helpful." This was very forward of me, but to my relief, the chairman didn't take offense. "That's a fine idea, Sayuri," he said. "I'll ask for you." Hold on. I just needed to get some water. Also, let me just... There we go. Yeah, this was very forward of me. But to my relief, the chairman didn't take offense. "That's a fine idea, Sayuri," he said. "I'll ask for you." But the weeks passed, and he didn't. One evening late in March, I dropped in on a very lively party given by the governor of Kyoto Prefecture at a tea house called Shunju. The chairman was there, on the losing end of a drinking game, looking exhausted in shirt sleeves and with his tie loosened. Actually, the governor had lost most of the rounds, as I'd learned, but held his sake better than the chairman. "I'm so glad you're here, Sayuri," he said to me. "You've got to help me. I'm in trouble." To see the smooth skin of his face splotched red, and his arms protruding from rolled up shirt sleeves. I thought at once of Yasuda-san on that night at the Tatamatsu tea house. For the briefest moment, I had a feeling that everything in the room had vanished but the chairman and me, and that in his drunk slightly drunken state, I might lean in toward him until his arms went around me and put my lips on his. I even had a flicker of embarrassment that I'd been so obvious in my thoughts that the chairman must have understood them. But if so, he seemed to regard me just the same. To help him, all I could do was conspire with another geisha. Yeah, to help him, all I could do was conspire with another geisha to slow the pace of the game. The chairman seemed grateful for this. Then, when it was all over, he sat up and talked with me a long while, drinking glasses of water to sober up. Finally, he took a handkerchief from his pocket, identical to the one tucked inside my obi, and wiped his forehead with it, and then smoothed his coarse black hair along his head before saying to me, "When was the last time you spoke with your old friend Nobu?" Not in quite some time, Chairman," I said. "To tell the truth, I have the impression Nobu-san may be angry with me." The chairman was looking down into his handkerchief as he refolded it. Friendship is a precious thing, Sayuri," he said. "One mustn't throw it away." I thought about this conversation often over the weeks that followed. Then one day, late in April, I was putting on my makeup for a performance of Dances of the Old Capitol, when a young apprentice I hardly knew came to speak with me. I put down my makeup brush, expecting her to ask a favor, because Aokia was still well supplied with things others. Let me say that again. One day late in April, I was putting on my makeup for a performance of Dances of the Old Capitol, when a young apprentice I hardly knew came to speak with me. I put down my makeup brush, expecting her to ask a favor, because Aokia was still well supplied with things others in Gion had learned to do without. But instead she said, "I'm terribly sorry to trouble you, Sayuri-san, but my name is Takazuru. I wondered if you would mind helping me. I know you were once a very good friends with Nobu-san." After months and months of wondering about him and feeling terribly ashamed for what I'd done, just to hear Nobu's name when I didn't expect it was like opening storm shutters and feeling the first draft of air. We must all help. Yeah, we must all help each other whenever we can, Takazuro, I said. "And if it's a problem with Nobu-san, I'm especially interested. I hope he's well." "Yes, he is, ma'am. Or at least I think so. He comes to the Awazumi Tea House in East Gion. Do you know it?" "Oh, yes, I know it," I said. "But I had no idea Nobu-san visited there." "Yes, ma'am, quite often," Takazuru told me. "But may I ask, Sayuri-san, you've known him a long while, and, well, Nobu-san is a kind man, isn't he?" "Takazuru-san, why do you ask me? If you've been spending time with him, surely you know whether or not he is." "I'm sure I must sound foolish, but I'm so confused. He asks for me every time he comes to Gion, and my older sister tells me he's a good patron as any girl could hope for. But now he's angry with me because I've cried in front of him several times. I know I shouldn't do it, but I can't even promise I won't do it again. He is being cruel to you, isn't he? He is being cruel to you, is he? By way of answering, poor Takazuru clenched her trembling lips together, and in a moment tears began to pool at the edges of her lids, so much that her little round eyes seemed to gaze up at me from two puddles. Sometimes Nobu-san doesn't know how harsh he sounds. Sometimes Nobu-san doesn't know how harsh he sounds, I told her. But he must like you, Takazuru-san. Otherwise, why would he ask for you? I think he asks for me only because I'm someone to be mean to, she said. One time he did say my hair smelled clean, but then he told me what a nice change that was. It's strange that you see him so often, I said. I've been hoping for months to run into him. Oh, please don't, Sayuri-san. He already knows how nothing about me is as good as you. If he sees you again, he'll only think the worst of me. I know I shouldn't bother you with my problems, ma'am, but I thought you might know something I could do to please him. He likes stimulating conversation, but I never know what to say. Everyone tells me I'm not a very bright girl. People in Kyoto are trained to say things like this, but it struck me that this poor girl might be telling the truth. It wouldn't have surprised me if Nobu regarded her as nothing more than the tree where the tiger might sharpen its claws. I couldn't think of anything helpful, so in the end I suggested she read a book about some historical event Nobu might find interesting, and tell the story to him bit by bit when they met. I myself had done this sort of thing from time to time. There were men who liked nothing more than to sit back with their eyes watery and half closed, listening to the sound of a woman's voice. I wasn't sure it would work with Nobu, but Takazuru seemed very grateful for the idea. Now that I knew where to find Nobu, I was determined to go and see him. I felt terribly sorry I'd made him angry with me. And of course, I might never see the chairman again without him. I certainly didn't want to cause Nobu pain, but I thought perhaps by meeting with him, I could find some way of resuming our friendship. The trouble was, I couldn't drop in uninvited at the Awazumi, for I had no formal relationship with the tea house. So in the end, I made up my mind to stroll past during the evening, whenever I could, in hopes of bumping into Nobu on his way there. I knew his habits well enough for to make a fair guess about the time he might arrive. For 8 or 9 weeks, I kept up this plan. Then at last, one evening, I spotted him emerging from the back of a limousine in the dark alleyway ahead of me. I knew it was him, because the empty sleeve of his jacket pinned. I knew it was him, because of the empty sleeve of his jacket, pinned at the shoulder, gave him an unmistakable silhouette. The driver was handing him his briefcase as I neared. I stopped in the light of the lantern there in the alley and let out a little gasp that would sound like delight. Nobody looked in my direction, just as I'd hoped. Well, well, he said. One forgets how lovely a geisha can look. He spoke in such a casual tone, I had to wonder whether he knew it was me. Why, sir, you sound like my old friend Nobu-san, I said. But you can't be him, for I have the impression he has disappeared completely from Guion. The driver closed the door, and we stood in silence until the car pulled away. I'm so relieved, I said, to see Nobu-san again at last, and what luck for me that he should be standing in the shadows rather than in the light. Sometimes I don't have the least idea what you're talking about, Sayuri. You must have learned this from Mamahan, or maybe they teach it to all the geisha. With Nobu-san standing in the shadows, I am unable to see the angry expression on his face. I see, he said. So you think I'm angry with you? What else am I to think when an old friend disappears for so many months? I suppose you're going to tell me that you've been too busy to come to the Ichiriki. Why do you say that as if it couldn't possibly be true? Because I happen to know that you've been coming to Gion, but don't bother to ask me how I know. I won't tell you unless you agree to come on a stroll with me. All right, said Nobu, since it's a pleasant evening. Oh, Nobu-san, don't say that. I'd much rather you said, since I've bumped into an old friend I haven't seen in so long, I can't think of anything I'd rather do than go on a stroll with her. I'll take a walk with you, he said. You may think whatever you like about my reasons for doing it. I gave a little bow of assent to this, and we went off together down the alley in the direction of Maruyama Park. If Nobu-san wants me to believe he isn't angry, I said, he should act friendlier, instead of like a panther who hasn't been fed for months. No wonder poor Takazuru is so terrified of you. So, she's spoken to you, has she? Said Nobu. Well, if she weren't such an infuriating girl. If you don't like her, why do you ask for her every time you come to Guion? I never asked for her even once. Yeah, I've never asked for her, not even once. It's her older sister who keeps pushing me at her. It's bad enough you've reminded me of her. Now you're going to take advantage of bumping into me tonight to try and shame me into liking her. Actually, Nobu-san, I didn't bump into you at all. I've been strolling down that alley for weeks, just for the purpose of finding you. This seemed to give Nobu something to think about, for we walked along in silence a few moments. Finally, he said, I shouldn't be surprised. You're as conniving a person as I know. Nobu-san, what else am I to do? I said. I thought you had disappeared completely. I might never have known where to find you if Takazuru hadn't come to me in tears to say how badly you've been treating her. Well, I have been hard on her, I suppose, but she isn't as clever as you, or as pretty, for that matter. If you've been thinking I'm angry with you, you're quite right. May I ask what I have done to make an old friend so angry? Here, Nobu stopped and turned to me with a terribly sad look in his eyes. I felt a fondness swelling up in me that I've known for very few men. Yeah, I felt a fondness swelling up in me that I've known for very few men in my life. I was thinking how much I had missed him, and how deeply I had wronged him. but though I am ashamed to admit it, my feelings of fondness were tinged with pity. After a considerable amount of effort, he said, I have discovered the identity of your Danna. If Nobu-san had asked me, I would have been glad to tell him. I don't believe you. You geisha are the most closed-mouthed group of people. I asked around Gion about your Danna, and one after another they all pretended not to know. I never would have found out if I hadn't asked Michizono to come entertain me one night. Just the two of us. Michizono was about 50 at the time, was a sort of legend in Gion. She wasn't a beautiful woman, but she could sometimes put even Nobu in a good mood, just for the way she crinkled her nose at him when she bowed hello. I made her play a drinking game with me, he went on, and I won, and won until poor Michizono was quite drunk. I could have asked her anything at all, and she would have told me. What a lot of work, I said. Nonsense. She was very enjoyable company. There was nothing like work about it. But shall I tell you something? I have lost respect for you. Now that I know your Danna is a little man in uniform whom no one desires. Nobu-san speaks as if I had any choice over who my Danna is. The only choice I can ever make is what kimono I'll wear. And even then, do you know why that man has a desk job? It's because no one trusts him with anything that matters. I understand the army very well, Sayuri. Even his own superiors have no use for him. You may as well have made an alliance with a beggar. Really, I was once very fond of you, but... Once? Is Nobu-san not fond of me any longer? Yeah, once. Once. Is Nobu-san not fond of me any longer? I have no fondness for fools. What a cold thing to say. Are you only trying to make me cry? Oh, Nobu-san. Oh, Nobu-san. Am I a fool because my Danna is a man you can't admire? You, geisha. There was never a more irritating group of people. You go around consulting your almanacs, saying, oh, I can't walk toward the east today because my horoscope says it's unlucky. But when it's a matter of something affecting your entire lives, you simply look the other way. Unless it's a matter of looking the other way, and then of closing our eyes to what we can't stop from happening. Is that so? Well, I learned a few things from my talk with Michizono that night when I got her drunk. You are the daughter of the Okiya Sayuri. You can't pretend you have no influence at all. It's your duty to use that influence you have, unless you want to drift through life like a fish belly up on the stream. I wish I could believe life really is something more than a stream that carries us along, belly up. All right, if it's a stream, you're still free to be part of it. All right, if it's a stream, you're still free to be in this part of it, or that part, aren't you? The water will divide again and again. If you bump and tussle and fight, and make use... Hold on, I'm so confused now. Yeah, alright. If it's a stream, you're still free to be a part in this. Yeah, so you're still free to be in this part of it, or that part, aren't you? The water will divide again and again, if you bump and tussle and fight, and make use of whatever advantages you might have. Oh, that's fine. I'm sure when we have advantages, you'd find them everywhere, if you ever bother to look. In my case, even when I have nothing more than, I don't know, a chewed up peach pit or something of the sort, I won't let it go to waste. When it's time to throw it out, I'll make good and certain to throw it at somebody I don't like. No, son. Are you counseling me to throw peach pits? Don't joke about it. You know perfectly well what I'm saying. We're very much alike, Sayuri. I know they call me Mr. Lizard and all that, and here you are, the loveliest creature in Gion. But that very first time I saw you at the sumo tournament years ago, what were you, 14? I could see what a resourceful girl you were even then. I've always believed that Nobu-san thinks me more worthy than I really am. Perhaps you're right. I thought you had something more to you, Sayuri, but it turns out you don't even understand where your destiny lies. To tie your fortunes to a man like the general, I would have taken proper care of you, you know. It makes me so furious to think about it. When this general is gone from your life, he'll leave nothing for you to remember him by. Is this how you intend to waste your youth? A woman who acts like a fool is a fool, wouldn't you say? If we rub a fabric too often, it would quickly grow threadbare. And Noah's words had rasped against me so much, I could no longer maintain that finely lacquered surface Mama had always counseled me to hide behind. I felt lucky to be standing in the shadow, for I was certain Nobu would think less of me if he saw the pain I was feeling. But I suppose my silence must have betrayed me, for with his one hand, he took my shoulder and turned me just a fraction until the light fell on my face. And when he looked me in the eyes, he let out a long sigh that sounded at first like disappointment. Why don't you seem so much older to me, Sayuri? He said after a moment. Sometimes I forget you're still a girl. Now you're going to tell me I've been too harsh with you. I cannot expect that Nobu-san should act like anyone but Nobu-san, I said. I react very badly to disappointment, Sayuri. You ought to know that. Whether you failed me because you're too young or because you aren't the woman I thought, either way you failed me, didn't you? Please, Nobu-san. It frightens me to hear you say these things. I don't know if I can ever live my life by the standards you used for judging me. What standards are those, really? I expect you to go through life with your eyes open. If you keep your destiny in mind, every moment in life becomes an opportunity for moving closer to it. I wouldn't expect this sort of awareness from a foolish girl like Takazuru, but hasn't Nobu-san been calling me foolish all evening? You know better than to listen to me when I'm angry. So Nobu-san isn't angry any longer? Then will he come to see me at the Ichiriki tea house? Or invite me to come and see him? In fact, I'm in no particular hurry this evening. I could come in even now, if Nobu-san asked me to. By now, we had walked around the block and were standing at the entrance of the tea house. I won't ask you, he said, and rolled open the door. I couldn't help but let out a great sigh when I heard this, and I call it a great sigh because it contained many smaller sighs within it. One sigh of disappointment, one of frustration, one of sadness, and I don't know what else. Oh, no, son, I said. Sometimes they're so difficult for me to understand. I'm not a very easy, I'm a very easy man to understand, Sayuri, he said. I don't like things held up before me that I cannot have. Before I had a chance to reply, he stepped into the tea house and rolled the door shut behind him. And that is the end of that chapter. We're going to do another one, and this is going to be the last one because it's pretty long. But yeah, man, ooh. Excuse me. I have to drink some more water. Okay. Ooh, man. Alright. Chapter 27. Alright, chapter 27. During the summer of that year, 1939, I was so busy with engagements, occasionally meetings with the general, dance performances, and the like, that in the morning when I tried to get up from my futon, I often felt like a bucket filled with nails. Usually, by mid-afternoon, I managed to forget my fatigue, but I often wondered how much I was earning through all my efforts. I never really expected to find out, however, so I was quite taken aback when Mother called me into her room one afternoon and told me I'd earned more in the past 6 months than both Hatsumomo and Pumpkin combined. Which means, she said, that it's time for you to exchange rooms with them. I wasn't as pleased to hear this as you might imagine. Hatsumomo and I managed to live side by side these past few years by keeping away from each other, but I regarded her as a sleeping tiger, not a defeated one. Hatsumomo certainly wasn't going to think of Mother's plan as exchanging rooms. She was going to feel that her room had been taken away from her. When I saw Namaha that evening, I told her what Mother had said to me and mentioned my fears that the fire inside Hatsumomo might flare up again. Sorry, I'm adjusting everything. Yeah, when I saw Namaha that evening, I told her what Mother had said to me and mentioned my fears that the fire inside Hatsumomo might flare up again. Oh well, that's fine, said Mamaha. This woman won't be bitten. That woman won't be beaten once and for all until we see blood, and we haven't seen it yet. Let's give her a bit of a chance and see what sort of mess she makes for herself this time. Early the next morning, Auntie came upstairs in the Okiya to lay down the rules for moving our belongings. She began by taking me into Hatsumomo's room and announcing that a certain corner now belonged to me. I could put anything I wanted there, and no one else could touch it. Then she brought Hatsumomo and Pumpkin into my smaller room and set up a similar space for the two of them. After we'd swapped our belongings, the move would be complete. I was set to work that very afternoon carrying my things through the hall. I wish I could say I'd accumulated a collection of beautiful objects as Mamaha probably had by my age. But the mood of the nation had changed greatly. Cosmetics and permanents had recently been banned as luxuries by the military government, though, of course, those of us in Gyeon, as playthings of the men in power, still did more or less as we pleased. Lavish gifts, however, were almost unheard of, so I'd accumulated nothing more over the years than a few scrolls, inkstones, and bowls, as well as a collection of stereoscopic photos of famous views, with a lovely viewer made of sterling silver, which the kabuki actor Onoe Yoegoro, the 13th, had given me. No, the 17th. Yeah, which the kabuki actor Onoe Yoegoro, the 17th, had given me. In any case, I carried these things across the hall, along with my makeup, undergarments, books, and magazines, and piled them into the corner of the room. But as late as the following evening, Hatsumomo and Pumpkin still hadn't begun moving their things out. On the way back from my lessons at noon on the third day, I'd made up my mind that if Hatsumomo's bottles and ointments were still crowded together on the makeup stand, I would go ask Auntie for help. To help me. When I reached the top of the stairs, I was surprised to see both Hatsumomo's door and mine standing open. A jar of white ointment lay broken on the hallway floor. Something seemed to be amiss, and when I stepped into my room, I saw what it was. Hatsumomo was sitting at my little table, sipping what looked like the smell of glass, sipping what looked like a small glass of water, reading a notebook that belonged to me. Geisha are expected to be discreet about the men they know, so you may be puzzled to hear that several years earlier, while still an apprentice, I'd gone into a paper store one afternoon and bought a beautiful book of blank pages to begin keeping a diary about my life. I wasn't foolish enough to write things down, the sorts of things a geisha is never expected to reveal. I only wrote about my thoughts and feelings. When I had something to say about a particular man, I gave him a code name. For example, I referred to Nobu as Mr. Suit because he sometimes made a little scornful noise with his mouth that sounded like suit, and I referred to the chairman as Mr. Ha because in one occasion he'd taken a deep breath and let it out slowly in a way that sounded like ha, and I'd imagined him walking beside me as he said it, of course. So, of course, it made a strong impression on me, but I'd never thought for a moment that anyone would see the things I'd written. Why, Sayuri, I'm so pleased to see you. Yeah, why, Sayuri, I'm so pleased to see you, Hatsumomo said. I've been waiting to tell you. Yeah, I've been waiting to tell you how much I'm enjoying your diary. Some of the entries are most interesting, and really your writing style is charming. I'm not much impressed, but with I'm not much impressed with your calligraphy, but did you happen to notice the interesting thing I wrote on the front page? I don't think I did. Let's see. Private. Well, now here's an example of what I'm talking about with your calligraphy. Hatsumomo, please put the book down on the table and leave my room. Really? I'm shocked at you, Sayuri. I'm only trying to be helpful. Just listen for a moment and you'll see. For example, why did you choose to give Nobu Toshikazu the name Mr. Su? It doesn't suit him at all. And I think you should have called him Mr. Blister or maybe Mr. One Arm. Don't you agree? You can change it if you want, and you don't even have to give me credit. Yeah, and you don't even have to give me any credit. I don't know what you're talking about, Hatsumomo. I haven't written anything about Nobu at all. Hatsumomo sighed, as if to tell me what an inept liar I was, and began paging through my journal. If it isn't Nobu you were writing about, I want you to tell me the name of a man you're referring to here. Let's see. Here it is. Sometimes I see Mr. Su's face blooming with anger when a geisha has been staring at him, but for my part, I can look at him as long as I want, and he seems to be pleased by it. I think his fondness for me grows from his feelings that I don't find the look of his skin and his missing arm as strange and frightening as many girls do. So I guess what you're telling me is that you know someone else who looks just like Nobu. I think you should introduce them. Think of how much they'll have in common. By this time, I was feeling sick at heart. I can't think of any better way of describing it. For it's one thing to find your secrets suddenly exposed, but when your own foolishness has exposed them, well, if I was prepared to curse anyone, it was myself for keeping the journal in the first place and stowing it where Hatsumomo could find it. A shoemaker who keeps his window open can hardly be angry when at the rainstorm for ruining his wares. When a shopkeeper who leaves his window open can hardly be angry at the rainstorm for ruining his wares. I went to the table to take the journal from Hatsumomo, but she clutched it to her chest and stood. In her other hand, she picked up the glass of what I thought was water. Now that I stood close to her, I could smell the odor of sake. It wasn't water at all. She was drunk. Sayuri, of course you want your journal back, and of course I'm going to give it to you, she said. But she was talking toward the door as she said it. The trouble is, I haven't finished reading it, so I'll take it back to my room, unless you'd rather I took it to Mother. I'm sure she'll be pleased to see the passages you've written about her. I mentioned earlier that a broken bottle of ointment lay on the floor of the hallway. This was how Hatsumomo did things, making a mess and not even bothering to tell the maids. But now as she left my room, she got what she deserved. Probably she'd forgotten about the bottle because she was drunk. In any case, she stepped right into the broken glass and let out a shriek. I saw her look at her foot a moment and make a gasping noise. But then she kept on going. I felt myself panicking as she stepped into her room. I thought of trying to wrestle the book from her hands, but then I remembered Mamaha's realization at the sumo tournament. To rush after Hatsumomo was the obvious thing. I'd be better off to wait until she began to relax, thinking she'd won, and then take the journal from her when she wasn't expecting it. This seemed to be a fine idea, until a moment later when I had an image of her hiding it in a place I might never find. By now, she closed the door. I went to stand outside it and called out quietly, Hatsumomo-san, I'm sorry if I seemed angry. May I come in? No, you may not, she said. I slid the door open anyway. The room was in terrible disarray because Hatsumomo had put things everywhere in her efforts at moving. The journal was sitting on the table. While Hatsumomo held the towel against her foot. I had no idea how I would distract her, but I certainly didn't intend to leave the room without the journal. She may have had the personality of a water rat, but Hatsumomo was no fool. If she'd been sober, I wouldn't even have tried to outsmart her right then. But considering her state at the moment, I looked around the floor at the piles of underclothing, bottles of perfume, and all the things she scattered in disarray. The closet door was open, and the tiny safe where she kept her jewelry stood ajar. Pieces were spilling out onto the mats as though she sat there earlier in the morning drinking and trying them on. And then one object caught my eye as clearly as a single star burning in a black sky. It was an emerald obi brooch, the very one Hatsumomo had accused me of stealing years earlier, on the night I'd found her and her boyfriend in the maid's room. I'd never expected to see it again. I walked directly to the closet and reached down to pluck it from among the jewelry lying there. What a wonderful idea, Hatsumomo said. Go on and steal a piece of my jewelry. Truthfully, I'd rather have the cash you'll have to pay me. I'm so pleased you don't mind, I told her. But how much cash will I have to pay for this? As I said these words, I walked over and held the brooch up before her. The radiant smile she'd worn now faded, just as the darkness fades from a valley when the sun rises on it. In that moment, while Hatsumomo sat stunned, I simply reached down to the table with my other hand and took the journal away. I had no notion how Hatsumomo would react, but I walked out the door and closed it behind me. I thought of going straight to Mother to show her what I'd found, but of course I couldn't very well go there with the journal in my hand. As quickly as I could, I slid open the door to the closet where in-season kimono were kept, and stashed the journal on a shelf between two ropes wrapped in tissue paper. It took no more than a few seconds, but all the while my back tingled from the sensation that at any moment Hatsumomo might open her door and spot me. After I'd shut the closet door again, I rushed into my room and began opening and closing the drawers to my makeup stand to give Hatsumomo the impression I'd hid the journal there. When I came out of the hallway, she was watching me from the doorway of her room, wearing a little smile as though she found the whole situation amusing. I tried to look worried, which wasn't too difficult, and carried the brooch with me into Mother's room to lay it on the table before her. She put aside the magazine she was reading and held it up to admire it. This is a lovely piece, she said, but it won't go far on the black market these days. No one pays for jewels like this one. Yeah, no one pays much for jewels like this one. I'm sure Hatsumomo will pay very dearly for it. I'm sure Hatsumomo will pay very dearly for it, Mother, I said. Do you remember the brooch I'm supposed to have stolen from her years ago? The one that was added to my debts? This is it. I've just found it on the floor near her jewelry box. Do you know, said Hatsumomo, who had come into the room and now stood behind me. I believe Sayuri is right. That is the brooch I lost, or at least it looks like it. I've never thought I'd see it again. Yes, it's very difficult to find things when you're drunk all the time. Yes, it's very difficult to find things when you're drunk all the time, I said. If only you'd looked in your jewelry box more closely. Mother put the brooch down on the table and went on glowering at Hatsumomo. I found it in her room, Hatsumomo said. She's hidden it in her makeup stand. Why were you looking through her makeup stand? Mother said. I didn't want to have to tell you this, Mother, but Sayuri left something on her table and I was trying to hide it for her. I know I should have brought it up to you at once, but she's been keeping a journal, you see. She showed it to me last year. She's written some very incriminating things about certain men, and truthfully, there are some passages about you too, Mother. I thought of insisting it wasn't true, but none of it mattered in any case. Hatsumomo was in trouble, and nothing she was going to say would change the situation. 10 years earlier, when she had been the Okia's principal earner, she probably would have accused me of anything she wanted. She could have claimed I had eaten the tatami mats in her room, and Mother would have charged me the cost of new ones. But now, at last, the season had changed. Hatsumomo's brilliant career was dying on the branch, while mine had slowly begun to blossom. I was the daughter of the Okiya, in its prime geisha. I don't think Mother even cared where the truth lay. There is no journal, Mother, I said. Hatsumomo was making it up. Am I? Said Hatsumomo. I'll just go find it then, and while Mother reads through it, you can tell her how I made it up. Hatsumomo went to my room, with Mother following. The hallway floor was a terrible mess. Not only had Hatsumomo broken a bottle and stepped on it, she tracked ointment and blood all over the upstairs hallway. Yeah, all over the upstairs hall. And much worse, on the tatami mats in her room, Mother's room, and now mine as well. She was kneeling at my dressing table when I looked in, closing the drawers very carefully and looking a bit defeated. Hold on. Okay. Looking a bit defeated. What journal is Hatsumomo talking about? Mother asked me. If there's a journal, I'm certain Hatsumomo will find it. Yeah, if there's a journal, I'm certain Hatsumomo will find it, I said. At this, Hatsumomo put her hands into her lap and gave a little laugh, as the whole thing had been some sort of game, and she had been cleverly outwitted. Hatsumomo, Mother said to her, you'll repay Sayuri for the brooch you accused her of stealing. What's more, I won't have the tatami in this okiya defiled with blood. They'll be replaced, and at your expense. This has been a very costly day for you, and it's hardly past noon. Shall I hold off calculating the total, just in case you're not quite finished? I don't know if Hatsumomo heard what Mother said. She was too busy glaring at me, and with a look on her face I wasn't accustomed to seeing. If you'd asked me while I was still a young woman to tell you the turning point in my relationship with Hatsumomo, I would have said it was my Mizuwage, even though it's quite true that my Mizuwage lifted me onto a higher shelf where Hatsumomo could no longer reach me. She and I might as well have gone on living side by side until we were old women, if nothing else had happened between us. This was this is why the real turning point. Yeah, this is why the real turning point, as I've come to see it, occurred the day when Hatsumomo read my journal, and I discovered the obi wrote she accused me of stealing. My way of explaining this is so. Let me tell you something. Yeah, by way of explaining this is so. Let me tell you something. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, Isoroku, yeah, Yamamoto Isoroku once said during an evening at the Ichibiki tea house. I can't, I can't pretend I was well acquainted with Admiral Yamamoto, who's usually described as the father of the Japanese Imperial Navy, but I was privileged to attend parties with him on a number of occasions. He was a small man, and keep in mind that a stick of dynamite is too small. Parties always grow noisier after the Admiral arrived. That night, he and another man were on the final round of a drinking game and had agreed that the loser would go buy a condom at the nearest pharmacy, just for the embarrassment of it. You understand, and not for any other purpose. Of course, the Admiral ended up winning, and the whole crowd broke into cheers and applause. It's a good thing you didn't lose, Admiral, said one of his aides. Think of the poor pharmacist looking up to find Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku on the other side of the counter. Everyone thought this was very funny, but the Admiral replied that he'd never had any doubt about winning. Oh, come now, said one of the geisha. Everyone loses from time to time. Even you, Admiral. I suppose it's true that everyone loses from at some time, he said, but never me. Some in the room may have considered this an arrogant thing to say, but I wasn't one of them. The Admiral seemed to me the sort of man who really was accustomed to winning. Finally, someone asked him the secret of his success. I never seek to defeat a man I am fighting, he explained. I seek to defeat his confidence. A mind troubled by doubt cannot focus on the course to victory. Two men are equals, true equals, only when they both have equal confidence. I don't think I realized it at the time, but after Hatsumomo and I quarreled over my journal, yeah, I don't think I realized it at the time, but after Hatsumomo and I quarreled about my journal, her mind, as the Admiral would have put it, began to be troubled by doubt. She knew that under no circumstances would Mother take her side against me any longer, and because of that, she was like a fabric taken from its warm closet and hung out of doors where the harsh weather will gradually consume it. If Mamaha were to hear me explaining things in this way, she would certainly speak up and say how much she disagreed. Her view of Hatsumomo was quite different from mine. She believed Hatsumomo was a woman bent on self destruction, and that we all needed to do was coax her along a path she was certain to follow in any case. Perhaps Mamaha was right. I don't know. It's true that in the years since my Mizuwage, Hatsumomo had gradually been afflicted by some sort of disease of the character, if such thing if such a thing exists. She had lost all control over her drinking, for example, and of her bouts of cruelty too, until her life began to fray. She'd always used her cruelty for a purpose, just as a samurai draws his sword. Not for slashing at random, but for slashing at enemies. But by this time in her life, Hatsumomo seemed to have lost sight of who her enemies were, and sometimes struck out even at Pumpkin. From time to time during parties, she even made insulting comments to the men she was entertaining. And another thing, she was no longer as beautiful as she had once been. Her skin was looking wax. Her skin was waxy looking and her features puffy. Or perhaps I was only seeing her that way. A tree may look as beautiful as ever, but when you notice the insects infesting it and the tips of the branches that are brown from disease, even the trunk seems to lose some of its magnificence. Everyone knows that a wounded tiger is a dangerous beast, and for this reason, Momoha insisted that we follow Hatsumomo around Gion during the evenings over the next few weeks. Hold on, I gotta adjust myself. Uh, Hold on, sorry. I gotta adjust myself because my back's getting tired. Hold on, quick break. Okay. Okay. Here we go. Everyone knows that a wounded tiger is a dangerous beast, and for this reason, Momoha insisted that we follow Hatsumomo around Gion during the evenings over the next few weeks. Partly, Momoha wanted to keep an eye on her, because neither of us would have been surprised if she'd sought out Nobu to tell him about the contents of my journal and about all my feelings for Mr. Ha, whom Nobu might have recognized as the chairman. But more important, Momoha wanted to make Hatsumomo's life difficult for her to bear. When you want to When you want to break a board, Mamaha said, cracking it in the middle all is only the first step. Success comes when you bounce up and down with all your weight until the board snaps in half. So every evening, except when she had an engagement she couldn't miss, Mamaha came to our Okia around dusk and waited to walk out the door behind Matsumomo. Mamaha and I weren't always able to stay together, but usually at least one of us managed to follow her from engagement to engagement for a portion of the evening. On the first night we did this, Hatsumomo pretended to find it amusing, but by the end of the fourth night, she was looking at us through squinted, angry eyes and had difficulty acting cheerful around men she tried to entertain. Then, early the following week, she suddenly wheeled around in an alleyway and came toward us. "Let me see now," she said. "Dogs follow the owners, and the two of you are following me around, sniffing and sniffing. So I guess you want to be treated like dogs. Shall I show you what I do with dogs I don't like?" And with this, she drew her hand to strike Mamaha on the side of the head. I screamed, which must have made Hatsumomo stop to think about what she was doing. She stared at me a moment with eyes burning before the fire went out of them, and she walked away. Everyone in the alley had noticed what was happening, and a few came over to see if Mamaha was all right. She assured them she was fine, and then said sadly, "Poor Hatsumomo. It must be just as the doctor said. She really does seem to be losing her mind." There was no doctor, of course, but Mamaha's words had the effect she'd hoped for. Soon a rumor had spread all over Gion that a doctor had declared Hatsumomo mentally unstable. For years, Hatsumomo had been very close to the famous kabuki actor Bando Shojido the Sixth. Shojido was what we call an onnagata, which means that he always played women's roles. Once, in a magazine interview, he said that Hatsumomo was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and on stage he often imitated her gestures to make himself seem more alluring. So you can well imagine that whenever Shojido was in town, Hatsumomo visited him. One afternoon, I learned that Shojido would attend a party later that evening at a tea house in the Geisha district of Pontocho, on the other side of the river from Gion. I heard this bit of news while preparing a tea ceremony for a group of naval officers on leave. Afterward, I rushed back to the Okia, but Hatsumomo had already dressed and snuck out. She was doing what I'd done once, leaving early so no one would follow her. I was very eager to explain to Mamaha what I'd learned, so I went straight to her apartment. Unfortunately, her maid told me she'd left a half hour earlier to worship. I knew exactly what that meant. Mamaha had gone to a little temple just at the eastern edge of Gion to pray before the three tiny Jizo statues she'd paid to have erected there. A Jizo, you see, honors the soul of a departed child. In Mamaha's case, they were for the three children she'd aborted at the Baron's request. Under other circumstances, I might have gone searching for her, but I couldn't possibly disturb her in such a private moment. And besides, she might not have wanted me to know even that she'd gone there. Instead, I sat in her apartment and permitted Tatsumi to serve me tea while I waited. At last, with something of a wary look about her, Mamaha came home. I didn't want to raise the subject at first, and so for a time we chatted about the upcoming festival of the ages, in which Mamaha was scheduled to portray Lady Murasaki Shikibu. 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 Yeah, Shikibu. Yeah, in which was scheduled to portray Lady Murasaki Shikibu, the author of the tale of. Let me say that whole sentence again. I didn't want to raise the subject at first, so for a time we chatted about the upcoming festival of the ages, in which Mamaha was scheduled to portray Lady Murasaki Shibiku. Shikibu. Yeah, to portray Lady Murasaki Shibiku. No, Shikibu. I am so dumb. Yeah, in which Mamaha was scheduled to portray Lady Murasaki Shikibu, author of the Tale of Genji. Yeah, author of the Tale of Genji. Finally, Mamaha looked up with a smile from her cup of brown tea. Tatsumi had been roasting the tea leaves when I arrived, and I told her what I discovered during the course of the afternoon. How perfect, she said. Hatsumomo's going to relax and think she's free of us. With all the attention Shoshiro is certain to give her at the party, she may feel renewed. Then you and I will come drifting in like some sort of horrid smell from the alleyway and ruin her evening completely. Considering how cruelly Hatsumomo had treated me over the years, and how very much I hated her, I'm sure I ought to have been elated by this plan. But somehow conspiring to make Hatsumomo suffer wasn't the pleasure I might have imagined. I couldn't help remembering one morning as a child when I was swimming in the pond near our tipsy house, and suddenly felt a terrible burning in my shoulder. Yeah, I couldn't help remembering one morning as a child when I was swimming in the pond near our tipsy house, and suddenly felt a terrible burning on my shoulder. A wasp had stung me and was struggling to free itself from my skin. I was too busy screaming to think of what to do. But one of the boys pulled the wasp off and held it with its wings upon a rock, where we all gathered to decide how to murder it. I was in great pain because of the wasp, and certainly felt no kindness toward it. But it gave me a terrible sensation of weakness in my chest now, in my chest to know that this tiny struggling creature could do nothing to save itself from the death that was only moments away. I felt the same sort of pity toward Tatsumomo. During evenings when we trailed her around Gion until she returned to the Okia just to get away from us, I almost felt as though we were torturing her. In any case, around 9 o'clock that night, we crossed the river to the Pontocho district. Unlike Gion, which sprawls over many blocks, Pontocho is just a single long alleyway stretched out along one bank of the river. People call it an eel's bed because of its shape. The autumn air was a bit chilly that night, but Shoshida's party was outdoors anyway, on a wooden veranda standing on stilts above the water. No one paid us much attention when we stepped out through the glass doors. The veranda was beautifully lit with paper lanterns, and the river shimmered gold from the lights of the restaurant on the opposite bank. Everyone was listening to Shojiro, who was in the middle of telling a story in his sing-song voice. But you should have seen the way Hatsumomo's expression soured when she caught sight of us. I couldn't help remembering I couldn't help remembering a damaged pear I'd held in my hand the day before, because amid the cheerful faces, Hatsumomo's expression was like a terrible bruise. Hamamaha went to kneel on the mat right beside Hatsumomo, which I considered very bold of her. I knelt toward the other end of the veranda, beside a gentle-looking man who turned out to be the koto player Tachibana Zensaku, whose scrawny old records I still own. Tachibana was blind, I discovered that night. Regardless of my purpose in coming, I would have been content to spend the evening just chatting with him, for he was such a fascinating, endearing man. But we'd hardly begun to talk when suddenly everyone burst out laughing. Shoshiro was quite a remarkable mimic. He was slender like the branch of a willow, with elegant, slow-moving fingers and a very long face he could move about in extraordinary ways. He could have fooled a group of monkeys into thinking he was one of them. At that moment, he was intimate. At that moment, he was imitating the geisha beside him, a woman in her 50s. With his effeminate gestures, his pursed lips, his rolls of the eyes, he managed to look so much like her that I didn't know whether to laugh or just sit with my hand over my mouth in astonishment. I had seen Shojiro on the stage, but this was something much better. Tachibana leaned in toward me and whispered, "What's he doing?" "He's imitating an older geisha beside him." "Ah," said Tachibana. "That would be Ichiwari." And then he tapped me with the back of his hand to make sure he had my attention. "The director of the Meece Theater," he said, and held out his little finger below the table where no one else could see it. In Japan, you see, holding up a finger means boyfriend or girlfriend. Tachibana was telling me that the older geisha, the one named Ichiwari, was the theater director's mistress. And in fact, the director was there too, laughing louder than anyone. A moment later, still in the midst of his mimicry, Shoshiro stuck one of his fingers up his nose. At this, everyone let out a laugh so loud you can feel the veranda trembling. I didn't know it at the time, but picking her nose was one of Ichiwari's well-known habits. She turned bright red when she saw this, and held a sleeve of her kimono over her face. And Shoshiro, who had drunk a good bit of sake, imitated her even then. People laughed politely, but only Hatsumomo seemed to find it really funny. For at this point, Shoshiro was beginning to cross the line into cruelty. Finally, the theater director said, Now, Shoshiro-san, save some energy for your show tomorrow. Anyway, don't you know you're sitting near one of Gion's greatest dancers? I propose that we ask for a performance." Of course, the director was talking about Mamaha. "Heavens, no. I don't want to see any dancing just now," Shoshiro said. As I came to understand over the years, he preferred to be the center of attention himself. "Besides, I'm having fun." "Shoshiro, we mustn't pass up an opportunity to see..." "Shoshiro, we mustn't pass up an opportunity to see the famous Mamaha," the director said, speaking this time without a trace of humor. Yeah, Shojiro. We mustn't pass up an opportunity to see the famous Monoha, the director said, speaking this time without a trace of humor. A few geishas spoke up as well, and finally Shojiro was persuaded to ask her if she would perform, which he did as sulkily as a little boy. Already I could see Hatsumomo looking displeased. She poured more sake for Shojiro, and he poured more for her. They exchanged a long look as if to say their party had been spoiled. A few minutes passed while a maid sent to fetch a shamisen, and one of the geisha tuned it and prepared to play. Then Momoha took her place against the backdrop of the tea house and performed a few very short pieces. Nearly anyone would have agreed that Momoha was a lovely woman, but very few people would have found her more beautiful than Hatsumomo. So I can't say exactly what caught Shoshiro's eye. It may have been the sake he drank, and it may have been Momoha's extraordinary dancing, for Shoshiro was a dancer himself. Whatever it was, by the time Momoha came back to join us at the table, Shoshiro seemed quite taken with her and asked that she sit beside him. When she did, she poured her. Yeah, when she did, he poured her a cup of sake and turned his back on Hatsumomo, as if she were just another adoring apprentice. Well, Hatsumomo's mouth hardened and her eyes shrank to about half their size. As for Momoha, I never saw her flirt with anyone more deliberately than she did with Shoshiro. Her voice grew high and soft, and her eyes swished from his chest to face his, and back again. From time to time, she drew the fingertips of her hand across the base of her throat, as though she felt self-conscious about this splotchy red that had appeared there. There wasn't really any blush, but she acted it so convincingly you wouldn't have known it without looking closely. Then one of the geisha asked Shoshiro if he'd heard from Baishuru-san. Baishuru-san, said Baijiru-san. Yeah, Baishuru-san, said Shoshiro, in his most dramatic manner, has abandoned me. I had no idea who Shoshiro was talking about, but Tachibana, the old koto player, was kind enough to explain in a whisper that Baijiru-san was the English actor Basil Rathbone, though I'd never heard of him at the time. Shoshiro had taken a trip to London a few years earlier and staged a kabuki performance there. The actor Basil Rathbone had admired it so much that with the help of an interpreter, the two of them had developed something of a friendship. Shoshiro may have lavished at the attention on women like Hatsumomo or Momoha, but the fact remained that he was homosexual, and since his trip to England, he had made it a running joke that his heart was destined to be broken, because Bajiru-san had no interest in men. It makes me sad, said one of the geisha quietly, to witness the death of a romance. Everyone laughed except for Hatsumomo, who went on glowering at Shoshiro. The difference between me and Bajiru-san is this. I'll show you. Shoshiro said, and with this he stood and asked Momoha to join him. He led her to one side of the room, where they had a bit of space. When I do my work, I look like this, he said, and he sashayed from one side of the room to the other, weaving his folding fan with the most fluid wrist, and let his head roll back and forth like a ball on the seesaw. Whereas when Bajiru, Bajiru-san does his work, he looks like this. Here, he grabbed Mamaha, and you should have seen the astonished expression on her face when he dipped her toward the floor in what looked like a passionate embrace, and planted kisses all over her face. Everyone in the room cheered and clapped. Everyone except Hatsumomo, that is. What is he doing? What is he doing? Tachibana asked me quietly. I don't think anyone else had heard, but before I could reply, Hatsumomo cried out, He's making a fool of himself, that's what he's doing. Oh, Hatsumomo-san, said Shoshiro. You're jealous, aren't you? Of course she is, said Mamaha. Now you must show us how the two of you make up. Go on, Shoshiro. Don't be shy. You must give her the very same kisses you gave to me. It's only fair, and in the same way. Shoshiro didn't have an easy time of it, but soon he succeeded in getting Hatsumomo to her feet. Then, with the crowd behind him, he took her in his arms and bent her back. But after only an instant, he jerked upright again, and with a shout, and grabbed his lip. Hatsumomo had bitten him. Not enough to make him bleed, but certainly enough to give him a shock. She was standing with her eyes squinted in anger, and her teeth exposed. And then she drew back her hand and slapped him. I think her aim must have been bad from all the sake she'd drunk, because she'd hit the side of his head rather than his face. What happened? Tachibana asked me. His words were as clear in the room of the his words were as clear in the quiet of the room as if someone had rung a bell. I didn't answer, but when he heard Shoshiro's whimper and the heavy breathing of Hatsumomo, I'm sure he understood. Hatsumomo-san, please, said Mamaha, speaking in a voice so calm it sounded completely out of place. As a favor to me, do try to calm down. I don't know if Mamaha's words had the precise effect she was hoping for, or whether Hatsumomo's mind had already shattered, but Hatsumomo threw herself at Shoshiro and began hitting him everywhere. I do think that, in a way, she went crazy. It wasn't just that her mind seemed to have fractured. The moment itself seemed disconnected from everything else. The theater director got up from the table and rushed over to restrain her. Somehow, in the middle of all this, Mamaha slipped out and returned a moment later with the mistress of the tea house. By that time, the theater director was holding Hatsumomo behind... by that time, the theater director was holding Hatsumomo from behind. I thought the crisis was over, but then Shoshiro shouted at Hatsumomo so loudly we heard it echo off the buildings across the river in Gion. You monster! He screamed. You've bitten me! I don't know what any of us would have done without the calm thinking of the mistress. She spoke to Shoshiro in a soothing voice, while at the same time giving the theater director a signal to take Hatsumomo away. As I later learned, he didn't take her... Oh yeah. This doesn't happen in the book, in the movie. A lot of what happens, like the past few chapters, it's not in the movie. Something else happens in the movie. Yeah, but it's sad. It's very sad to watch. Like, you hate Hatsumomo, but also just watching this, like, Yeah, she's going. Okay. She spoke to Shoshiro in a soothing voice, while at the same time giving the theater director a signal to take Hatsumomo away. As I later learned, he didn't just take her inside the tea house. He took her downstairs to the front and shoved her out onto the street. Hatsumomo didn't return to the Okia at all that night. When she did come back the following day, she smelled she smelled as if she had been sick to her stomach, and her hair was in disarray. She was summoned once to Mother's room and spent a long while there. A few days afterward, oh shit. Damn. Okay. A few days afterward, Hatsumomo left the Okia, wearing a simple cotton robe Mother had given her, and with her hair as I'd never seen it, hanging in a mass around her shoulders. She carried a bag containing her belongings and jewelry and didn't say goodbye to any of us, but just walked down the street. She didn't leave voluntarily. Mother had thrown her out. And in fact, Mama had believed Mother had probably been trying to get rid of Hatsumomo for years. Whether or not this is true, I'm sure Mother was pleased at having fewer mouths to feed, since Hatsumomo was no longer earning what she once had, and food had never been more difficult to come by. If Hatsumomo hadn't been renowned for her wickedness, some other Okia might have wanted her even after what she'd done to Shojiro. But she was like a tea kettle that, even on a good day, might still scald the hand of anyone who used it. Everyone in Gion understood this about her. I don't know for sure what ever became of Hatsumomo. A few years after the war, I heard she was making a living as a prostitute in the Miwagawa-cho district. She couldn't have been there long, because on the night I heard of it, a man at the same party swore that if Hatsumomo was a prostitute, he would find her and give her some business of his own. He did go looking for her, but she was nowhere to be found. Over the years, she probably succeeded in drinking herself to death. She certainly would have been the first geisha to do it. In just the way that a man can grow accustomed to a bad leg, we'd all grown accustomed to having Hatsumomo on our Kia. I don't think we quite understood all the things her presence had afflicted us. Yeah, I don't think we quite understood all the ways her presence had afflicted us until long after she'd left, when things that we hadn't realized were ailing slowly. I don't think we quite understood all the ways her presence had afflicted us until long after she'd left, when things we hadn't realized were ailing slowly began to heal. Even when Hatsumomo had been doing nothing more than sleeping in her room, the maids had known she was there, and that during the course of the day she would abuse them. They'd lived with the kind of tension you feel if you walk across a frozen pond whose ice might break at any moment. And as for Pumpkin, I think she'd grown to be dependent on her older sister and felt strangely lost without her. I'd already come to Okia's principal I'd already become the Okia's principal asset, and even I took some time to weed out all the particular habits that had taken root because of Hatsumomo. Every time a man looked at me strangely, I found myself wondering if he had heard something unkind about me from her, even long after she was gone. Whenever I climbed the stairs to the second floor of the Okia, I still kept my eyes lowered for fear that Hatsumomo would be waiting there on the landing, eager for someone to abuse. I can't tell you how many times I reached that last step and looked up suddenly with the realization that there was no Hatsumomo, and there never would be again. I knew she was gone, and yet the very emptiness of the hall seemed to suggest something of her presence. Even now, as an older woman, I sometimes lift the brocade cover on the mirror of my makeup stand and have the briefest flicker of a thought that I may find her there in the glass, smirking at me. And that is the end of that chapter. Yeah, I forgot how Hatsumomo is rid of, is gotten rid of in the book. I feel like it's a little sadder in the movie, but that's just me. This is pretty bad too, but yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for watching, listening. I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.